My name's Gill Phillips. I'm the Director of Editorial Legal Services at The Guardian newspaper in London, which means I look after our editorial content and our journalism. The 2016 study that The Guardian did, called The Web We Want, was looking at below-the-line comments on journalists' articles and trying to do an assessment of what sort of abuse was being suffered generally across the board. And I think they weren't doing it deliberately to see whether women journalists were getting the target. They were looking generally at journalists. But what came out of that was that women and also black and ethnic minority journalists were getting by far and away a disproportionate amount of abuse and unpleasant comments and more than their male colleagues. I mean, the reasons for why women are attacked, I think, probably are old and historic. That there's a lot of people out there who don't like women doing the roles that they do as journalists, and so they see that they can attack them in that way. Women are more vulnerable in some ways than men traditionally. They're doing roles that are not traditional roles, and that can threaten some men. So I think there's a lot of complicated societal reasons. We have to look at what the harassment is. We've set up in the back of getting the information that we got from The Web We Want, and that made us ask us as an organisation, what culturally we wanted for our journalists. And as a result of that, we've just put in place, I mean, nothing complicated, it's not rocket science. We've just put in place some guidance, really, both for journalists about how to stay safe online. So, the basic sort of educational stuff, really, around passwords and personal information. But we've also put in place some guidance for managers so that when journalists come to them and say, I'm being harassed, the managers also have some guidance, because one of the things was that people weren't used to dealing with this and they didn't know how to deal with it. So it's been a learning process for the journalist about what they can do, but also for the managers about how they should respond. I think there are two different routes there when you're talking about sort of the law coming in. I mean, there's a civil law, so in some instances a journalist may wish to avail themselves of getting some sort of injunction to stop someone coming close to them, either in the physical space or the online space. And that's a sort of court issue for that the Guardian could certainly help the journalist with in the right instance. Going to the police is a criminal matter, obviously, and generally speaking, that is very much down to the individual journalist. They have to make a complaint for the police to take any notice of it, even if we're supporting of it. So it's got to be a collaborative process in that way. And ultimately, you're making difficult decisions and you're making practical decisions. If someone who is abusing you is in a country that's a very long way away, and you're in the UK, there's only a limited amount that the UK police might be able to do practically. They may be able to contact their colleagues abroad, and they may be able to do things like that. So you're having to weigh up, whether what you're going to achieve is going to achieve what you want it to in practical terms. I think for the journalist, one of the big questions is this going to make matters worse? Are they going to get more attention from whoever it is because they're taking them on, if you like, through the courts? There's a lot of criminal laws that already apply to abuse and harassment online. I mean, some of them weren't invented for online. They were invented for old days of letters, but they still translate into the online space. Those are not specifically geared at women. They're just geared at abuse and the use of whether it's sending a letter or an email, abuse in that sort of sense. I think one of the problems possibly is that in terms of hate speech, if you're talking about unlawful speech, in the UK, most of the definitions of hate speech are built around race and religion, and some sexual orientation, there's not much about sex in terms of women being targeted. So I think there's a bit of a gap there. I think there's also an issue around education, around the people who are doing these things. Sometimes they don't really appreciate the impact that they're having. They're swelled along by others, and I think that sometimes prosecuting an individual who has made a very nasty, abusive, horrible comment may not be the best way forward in terms of criminalising them, as opposed to some sort of educational process that maybe can take them out of the system and give them some training and thought about what they're doing and the implications of it.